Welcome, everyone. My guest today is Managing Editor James Kleimann to talk about how the election of Donald Trump and what's happening in congressional elections could impact the housing market, including regulation, GSE conservatorship, HUD, AI, and more. Big thanks to Optimal Blue for sponsoring this episode. James, welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for jumping on. We had some other things scheduled, and I was like, I need to have you on. We've had Logan on 3 times this week just to walk us through some of the mortgage rate implications of the election. But I wanted to kind of get a broader view and a different view by having you on and talk about some of the stories we're working on, especially some of the angles we're taking to serve the audience right now to be like, this is what to do. And it was a really close election. I'm not sure anybody had the tea leaves. I see you doing this with your head. It ended up not being a close election. I think ahead of time, it was hard to know what was going to happen. At least looking at the polls, it seemed very close. So I think that we could say, while it wasn't the surprise of 2016, it was, it was at least some surprise.
Yeah, the New York Times sent out a blast yesterday to all of its email subscribers, and it had I think the story was something like the 4 scenarios of the election, and they gave equal weight to all 4. The first is a Harris victory that is a little, unsure about Congress and all that. The other was a Trump victory, and then there were 2 that are basically like could be blowouts on either side, and ended up more or less being a Trump blowout. And what we're focused on right now is, first of all, we have to see what happens in some of the key congressional races. So Trump will be in office on January 20th, and the Senate will be heavily red, so he has a supermajority there. And then in Congress, it does look like he's going to have, there's a very good chance that he also has a majority in the House of Representatives as well. We don't know yet. This could take a couple days. It could take a couple weeks, depending on how the counting goes in a couple jurisdictions. But it does look, at minimum, that it's going to be a lot redder than the people we've talked to who have provided their forecasts of, hey, what does the next 4 years potentially look like? They all kind of said, we think it's going to be some version of gridlock. The NBA said that most recently at NBA Annual. I've spoken to a bunch of folks in Washington who closely study the politics in housing and the administrations. They all expected a divided Congress,
right,
and thought that we'd more or less have a version of what we've had the last 4 years, but potentially maybe a different, we'd have an elephant in the White House instead of a donkey. That doesn't look likely anymore. And so what that probably means is the Trump agenda in housing could get started a lot earlier than people had anticipated.
I think that is a really fascinating comment and thought there, because we did think, okay, well, there's these things that he wants to do. He didn't have a lot of plans. He didn't have outlined plans for housing as much as Harris did, right? I mean, I think that was when he said he had concepts of a plan. So we had some tangible things we were reporting on with Harris, a little bit harder at Trump, but now it's like, he might have a smoother road. So the big thing that comes to my mind is GSE reform. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the $320 billion question, right? And so I attended a luncheon in DC a couple months ago. It was put together by the CHLA, and we had a couple interesting folks. We had Jim Parrott, who was formerly in the Obama White House, who's an expert on housing policy. And then we had Mark Calabria, who was the former head of the FHFA. He was the director, of course. And they talked about the potential for exits from conservatorship. And Mark Calabria was pretty clear that if Trump got another term, he would absolutely move to take them out of conservatorship. I think it's a little bit harder to do than people might initially think. It's like, oh, okay, well, Trump is in office. He has the House. He has the Senate. He shouldn't have any political roadblocks in that sense in terms of the votes to do it. But people also often forget that there wasn't unanimity in the Trump White House before. They had an opportunity when Steve Mnuchin and Mark Calabria were in office toward the latter stages of the first Trump administration, and they weren't able to do it. And I've heard from a number of people in Washington that the reason they weren't able to do it is because not everybody in the White House agreed that removing the GSEs from conservatorship was the right move. And there are huge political consequences and practical consequences to the housing market, for forgetting even the political implications to making such a major change. And I think the first thing to start talking about would be, right now we see the relationship between the FHFA and Fannie and Freddie is more of a parent-child relationship.
Right.
What does that relationship look like if there's, active conversations about removing Fannie and Freddie from conservatorship? What sort of power does the FHFA hold? I think there are templates for a Trump administration to remove Fannie and Freddie from conservatorship if they want to, but you have a lot of big questions to address. So, it's always that the last yard is the hardest. And I think you have to think about the guarantee fee. You have to think about the debt limit, which is going to expire on January 2nd. You would potentially have a really big shortfall with the 2017 tax cuts. They make it all rather complicated. And then you still have about, $320 billion in GSE shares that are owned by the Treasury, and another, I think it's like 30 billion owned by investors and hedge funds. And so if the Treasury still has warrants to purchase 80% of that common stock, that's money owed to the government. So we're talking about huge political contributions here. If you take away $320 billion amid a debt limit debate, that's a pretty hard bargaining position. So I think that it's really difficult to remove the GSEs, even if everybody wanted to and really had a plan and a template in mind, because you have these other really significant conversations about what the tax bill looks like, what the debt limit looks like. Are you giving money to hedge funders and private equity firms? And, then we haven't even gotten into the, everyday, the boring stuff about how to manage the MBS markets and how to manage lenders and, the G fees. And it's really hard stuff. And it's, there's a reason no one's seriously gotten very close to doing this. And so even though Mark Calabria had initially said in the conversation in DC that he thought 2027 was a decent, expectation for Fannie and Freddie to be removed from conservatorship, in some ways you can think of that as both optimistic and pessimistic, right? On the one hand, now that, Calabria thought that there would be a much more divided Washington, more gridlock when he said this. It's looking like it may not be like that. But is he maybe underselling how hard it is to get the GSEs out of conservatorship? That's possible too.
Well, and I think, we saw that in President Trump's first term, right? Towards the end, it came up and they just ran out of time. It is a complicated process. They did have other dynamics at that point, but I think you brought up some great points. If you were to see, I don't know, a continuation under Vance or whoever else, like you can imagine if there were 8 years here, that's a much more doable goal. But if you go into it, like you said, with some, with some tailwinds there to help you out, maybe it's possible. It was one of the things when I asked Bob Brooksmith a couple months ago, I was like, how do you weigh as the MBA looking at housing issues, the pros and cons of each candidate, of each candidate's policies. And, the pro on Trump was potentially a lot less regulation. But one of the hard things about it is it could, if you take the GSEs out of conservatorship, you are introducing some chaos into the system, or at least some uncertainty into the system. Mm-hmm. You're messing with something that right now is working very well. Maybe not if you're a private investor, but I'm just saying, this is something that lenders don't even have to think about right now. So I think that that's really interesting that might be. So maybe the next topic is regulation, because we know that even if he's not going to dismantle a bunch of stuff, he's probably also not going to, he's not going to be championing some of the issues that we saw in the Biden administration.
I think a lot of the folks that I talk to in the affordable housing space are pretty nervous. I think there's an expectation that the Trump administration is going to prioritize affordable housing issues, especially for those who are in urban areas and rural areas, less than has been done on under the Biden administration, Biden Harris. So that's a concern. There is definitely a concern that the HUD budget is going to get slashed. They're going to have to find some money somewhere. And if Elon Musk and his proclamation that he's going to find, what is it? I think it was $2 trillion
Right.
in government waste. I don't think that's actually achievable in any legitimate construct. But if he does go looking for money, if he looks for departments, agencies to raid, historically, the Republicans have gone after housing focused agencies. So I think that would certainly be a concern. In terms of the regulatory and enforcement framework, this is where we just don't really know. And so there's this common refrain that under Trump, like, we're just going to get rid of, like all of this regulatory mumbo jumbo and these silly lawsuits that Rohit Chopra and the DOJ and the FTC are fighting every day behind the scenes against some of America's biggest companies, including some of the most visible in the lending space and in housing. I don't know that that's necessarily true. In his last year in office, Trump initiated, I think it was like 48 enforcement actions through the CFPB. Biden has not done that. Biden has actually been a little bit, I don't want to say friendlier. I know that the industry, especially mortgage, has been very critical of enforcement, but the way the CFPB under Biden enforces rules is not through the enforcement mechanism. Right. It's a lot of circulars, it's a lot of policy, it's a lot of like quarterly reports that they say, hey, this is what we're expecting all of the people who work at these companies to be doing. And if you don't, then there's the threat of a big stick, but the big stick isn't actually used very often. And so I do think that there is a strong possibility that Trump takes a really hard look at some of the big appraisal and valuation focused changes. The people in his orbit are typically those who say that these claims of racism are, overly broad and they're not specific, and there are no specific cases in which someone can definitively say that an appraiser out there has provided a low valuation because of someone else's distinct characteristics. So I think that's something that it seems like kind of a red meat issue for a lot of the folks in that space. I do think that there's a new CFPB director on day one. There's no way that Rohit Chopra is going to be in office on January 21st, 2025. To that end, I think Sandra Thompson, the head of the FHFA, is also gone. There is an acting head at HUD right now. I think it's very unlikely that she will be in power on the 21st. Who comes in and fills these roles? We don't really know. There haven't been any specific names floated, although because Trump was in office for 4 years, there are veterans of that administration. And I know a couple of them are definitely angling for jobs, but we don't know who specifically would be taking over. That said, a lot of folks have been vetted already. And so the process that occurred last time, in which there were a lot of acting directors and a lot of important people who didn't have the official title, I don't think that would happen going forward, if only because you don't have the Democrats to say, we're just not going to do this. Trump may also even remove the filibuster, which would make everything even smoother in that respect. So we already have a lot of people who have been through the vetting process, who have some degree of familiarity with housing, that are probably going to be looking for jobs in the new administration. And they should be able to get work done much earlier than a lot of people had expected.
I think that is absolutely true of last time. They didn't have a really great transition team. They didn't have a lot of things in place. This time we see not only have they done it before, but they had the whole Project 2025 where they were laid out kind of like how they were going to potentially fire a bunch of people who are currently in positions, even down to a bureaucratic level, just kind of like your general workers, not even at the top, and then fill those with people who they've already identified who might be more amenable to them. So, did they mention? I know Department of Education is a big part of that 2025. Is HUD anywhere in there?
Yeah, Sarah, the Project 2025 playbook comes in at 922 pages. There are about 14 pages that cover HUD, and you'll never guess who the author of this section is.
I might be able to guess. You tell me.
It's Ben Carson.
Yep, that's what I
Yeah.
figured.
So the housing section is very similar to some of the other areas of the document in that it's very focused on minimizing government bureaucracy. And it also emphasizes a need to shift American priorities to those that align with kind of the broader values of the conservative movement. So it's a lot of smaller government, self-determination, in the form of limiting the scope of assistance programs, encouraging the nuclear family, and placing more agency control under political appointments rather than these career officials. And that's always been sort of a point of tension at HUD and some of the other agencies, the political officials, and then the career officials who believe that they have the expertise and are, less focused on the political, um, you know, nitpicks and are there serving the American public, right? So there's always that tension anyway, but I think it's fair to say that if this were to occur and the Trump administration has not said that this is part of his plan or anything like that, he's not endorsed Project 2025, but the fact that a lot of his prior officials have, been responsible for writing significant content within it gives a lot of people pause. So, yeah, I mean, there's also some potential repeal of climate change related initiatives and terminology from official HUD policy. So, there's a lot in there. I think you have to remember that these are reports that have been issued by the Heritage Foundation since the early 1980s. And generally speaking, they're not acted on, regardless of who's in power. I think the Democrats have done a pretty good job of, you know, pointing it out, drawing attention to it, but that didn't help them on Tuesday. And we can only speculate as to whether Ben Carson would come back or if he's serious about pursuing any of these goals. We just don't know because, again, there's not a whole lot that's been said specifically about the Trump administration's housing agenda for the next 4 years.
So I think it's really interesting on a couple of levels. For one, I think about the fact that, at NBA, Bob Brooksmith called again for like a housing leader, right? We've said a housing czar. Those are not his words.
Right.
Just
But
like we did.
remember, Sarah, I am supposed to be that housing czar. We've talked about this before.
We have talked about this. So we talked about this after he brought it up at the servicing conference, because he's like, like someone needs to lead in this thing. And we talked to, the head acting director, and we're like, hey, is this you? And she was like, yeah, I think, I mean, HUD, housing's in our name. So it reminds me of like, who is the leader of housing who is thinking about it the way that maybe some of us think about it, right? If you think, and there's lots of different constituencies. The, affordable housing folks probably think very differently in some ways than, your home builder or your lender or your LO. I mean, there's all these different parts of the housing industry. But I do think it's going to be interesting. What is the leadership there? If you got some of these departments, what is there to lead? What teeth do you have? What boots on the ground do you have? We'll see. The other thing that comes to my mind is the fact that, the Biden administration had an executive order, and by that executive order, every department and an agency had to have a chief AI officer. This was an unfunded mandate. So, for instance, we had Vinay Singh, who is the CFO at HUD. come and talk to our AI summit because he's also the chief AI officer at HUD. That's a pretty big job, both of those. He was already planning to retire or move before, not retire, sorry, move at the end of this year. But like, what happens to all of those positions? Does Musk look at that because he's in charge of that maybe and say, that's really good, we need that? Or, and it doesn't cost him any money. All of these agencies have figured out a way to do it without, any money. Or does he go, I don't really want people to do that? So I think that that's going to be interesting too.
Or he says, this is actually really interesting, but these aren't the people I want doing it.
Right.
And I know all kinds of technologists in Silicon Valley and in Austin, Texas, who are ready to step in and apply this. One thing that we have heard pretty consistently is, even from Mike Johnson, the congressional leader on the Republican side, is that they want AI to have relatively few shackles. They don't want bureaucracy stepping in and limiting the effectiveness or the potency of AI as it relates to the economy. And that's a pretty interesting and different perspective than what we have seen over the last couple of years, in which AI has really exploded. And on the lending side, no one wants to be that first lender who says, I have this AI engine or whatever making decisions about credit worthiness or about
except UWM. They went on record saying they do want to be the first one doing that. But yes, besides UWM, besides Rocket, no.
And nobody thinking that Rohit Chopra is going to be in office, or that there might be a Democratic figure at the head of the CFPB, that we don't want to be the first scalp, right?
Right.
Maybe that perspective changes, and if they're getting hints or they're receiving word that the Trump administration would rather there be a file or two here and there in which AI does inadvertently discriminate against them, but it is something that cuts the cost of manufacturing alone by 40%, then that's worth it, right? And I think it's a more complicated question than a lot of people have at least acknowledged, in that we have this history of regulation from 2008. It has probably increased the cost of manufacturing a loan by at minimum $5,000 per loan.
Right.
All of the compliance costs that lenders need to bear that do get passed on to consumers. Have we overcorrected? Have we tried to fix a problem that wasn't really a problem in the first place? And so if I think that the best case scenario here is AI is sophisticated enough, good enough, and you still have enough staffers who have good judgment that they're limiting the amount of potential discrimination. And by the way, there is still discrimination today in some form.
Right.
It is extremely unlikely that there is no one who has been discriminated against getting a mortgage in America in the last 4 years, regardless of all the tools that lenders have and all the compliance apparatus that are out there. So it's still going to happen on some level. How much is acceptable? It's kind of like, you ever read those studies about how like there's a certain amount of like rat feces in cereal every year? Like, even though they have all of these tools and that, like, that's allowed. Yeah, I'm sorry, that's kind of a yucky reference here. But you are going to have one or two or 10 or 100 or 1,000 or whatever that number ends up being, cases in which there is an adverse condition, and that sucks and that's terrible and that's unfortunate. But if we're able to shave off $6,000, $7,000 from the cost of manufacturing alone, that can really do a lot of good in building out, a better future for the American homeowner. And so I think that's the most hopeful reading of it. And I don't know that independently is enough to even get to that number, whatever it ends up being. But certainly I think a lot of lenders are looking at today and thinking there's a better likelihood in the next 4 years that I'll be able to use AI and other technologies out there and really reduce my costs that I would not have had under a Harris administration.
No, I think that's true. And then I think on the other side, maybe you have to be careful that we don't get into trouble. the mortgage industry by themselves can't really get into that trouble anymore but if there's systemic changes, to banking, to mortgage, if there's a lot of things that maybe chip away at that Dodd-Frank, you could see it becoming a riskier environment. But I agree with you on this is the net that everyone's trying to crack. How do you get mortgage to be less expensive to originate? It shouldn't be that expensive.
Yeah, it shouldn't. And we also don't know what Trump would continue in terms of some of the regulatory priorities. We don't know if he's going to be looking deeply at title insurance as something that they want to reduce the costs of, using the FHFA as its vehicle. We don't know if that will be a similar prerogative with regard to appraisal. We haven't even touched on the home building process, Sarah, and immigration, right? He's talked quite a bit about mass deportations. I got a bit of a newsflash for you. That's not great for the construction industry. It is their workforce. Now, is that just campaign bluster? Is that something he's serious about? Or is it just an exaggeration, knowing that the base gets really excited about this and is more likely to get a vote? We don't know yet. And that's one of the hard things about trying to guess what an administration through 2028 is going to look like, because he's had very little of substance when it comes to housing.
Yeah, we have a lot of questions. I just want to say thank you for being on. Thanks for guiding our newsroom during this time. Very excited already at the coverage. I thought we did a great job leading up to the election, really laying things out, doing all the reporting that we could. And then now, our focus is really on what's happening, but also how does this impact your business, right? It's the day one story on the news, but it's the day two story of and this is what it means. And this is the analysis. And this is, the other information you need to know. So just want to say kudos to that. And thanks for being on.
Cool. Thanks for having me, Sarah.